everybody. I hope you're keeping yourself safe and staying in and keeping yourselves all well. I'm going to read you a little excerpt from one of my favourite books. I'm sure my Year 6 class will already know what book it's going to be, but it's going to be Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4, Privet Drive, were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunding's, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came very useful when she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences spying on the neighbours. Mr. Dursley and Mrs. Dursley had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think that they'd bear it if anybody found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years, and in fact Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister at all, because her sister was a good-for-nothing, and her husband was as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived on the street, and the Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too. They'd never even seen him. This boy was another good reason to keep the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a grey, dull Tuesday, that's where our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside that would suggest that the strange and mysterious things would soon be about to happen all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring type of work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was having one of those tantrums and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," Mr. Dursley said as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar, a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realise what he'd seen. Then he jerked his head back around again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there was no map in sight. What could he have been thinking? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove round the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on these young people these days. He supposed it was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell on the huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. That man had to be older than he was, and he was wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him. But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some sort of silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. That had to be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later Mr. Dursley arrived at Grunding's car park, and his mind was back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never even seen an owl at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and then shouted a little bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him feel uneasy. This lot were whispering, excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back to them, he clutching a large doughnut in his bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right. That's what I heard. Yeah, their son Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as though he wanted to say something to them, but then he thought better of it. He dashed back across the street, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb them, seized his telephone, and when he'd almost finished dialing his home number, and then he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his moustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had sons called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen him. It might have been Harvey or Harold or... There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset when anyone mentioned her sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, but when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into somebody just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realised the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile and he had a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare. Oh, don't be sorry. For nothing had upset me today. Rejoice, you know who's gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day. And the old man hugged Mrs. Dursley round the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He'd just been hugged by a complete stranger. He'd also thought he'd been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping he was imagining things, which he'd never hoped for before, because he just didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and didn't improve his mood, was the same tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. Now it was on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same marking round its eyes. Shoo, said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move, just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behaviour? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learnt a new word. Shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last news report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported today that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in the daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise this morning. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreader allowed himself a little bit of a grin. Most mysterious. And now, over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me about, instead of rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen into his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain. Owls by daylight. Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place. And whispers about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard of your sister lately, have you? As he's expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they just pretended she didn't have a sister normally. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny enough. And there's funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were funny-looking people in town today. So? Snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, Halo. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her that he dared the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, their son, he's got to be about Dudley's age now, hasn't he? Suppose so, Mrs. Dursley said stiffly. What's his name again? Is it Howard? Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me. Oh, yeah, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking terribly. Yeah, I quite agree with you there. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed, and while Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered into the front garden. That cat was still there. It was staring down at Privet Drive as though it was waiting for someone. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to the pair, he couldn't bear it. The Dursleys got into bed and Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly. But Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. At last, his last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come anywhere near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia, they thought of them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It wouldn't and couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was.